that we can find some solutions. All of us have to work together on this. Obviously, we have not found the solution. We think we know what works. We have to do that. We have to ramp things up, but we have a lot to teach each other. And I'm hoping that post-Afghanistan, at least the conversations I'm having with other government officials from other governments, people are in a very positive mode of let's assess what we know works, what hasn't worked, and moving forward together in a way that's mutually supportive and not at odds with each other.
Great, thank you very much. Madam Chair, I hope as we go forward, we'll have an opportunity to probe a bit further into our efforts post-Afghanistan and whether our allies view us differently coming out of that as we approach all of these really critically important issues. And I want to thank you, Chair Bass, for holding this hearing and for giving us the opportunity to participate. It's really important. I so admire, as you know, your work in this area, and I'm honored to be able to work on this with you in this instance. And thanks very much, and I yield back.
Well, absolutely, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate working with you. We should do this more often. We have a lot of things in common, and we should definitely do that. Well, I want to follow your questions to Mr. Jenkins. You know, as you mentioned the help that is being given in the Sahel and all, and you mentioned the French, and you mentioned the G5, I just wonder, do we ever come together with our European partners and talk about how to bolster the African Union? Because at some point in the future, it would be nice to think of when there are conflicts that they are managed by other African countries. There was a great example where the countries of ECOWAS intervened when a president refused to leave power. And so I just want to know if that is ever a discussion that you're aware of with our European partners.
Thank you, Chair Bass. I'll be quick because I believe that Das Gonzalez might have more on this than I do. Yeah. That we currently have the Partnership for Peace program, which works with the Executive Secretary of the G5 Sahel. We've done a lot of work directly with the African Union through Women, Peace, and Security, helping them get both a continental women, peace, and security strategy, but also working on individual nation states with their own strategies. But you mentioned ECOWAS as well, whether it's SADC or ECOWAS, we look to regional partners who they're going to have the better ideas than we do. We're there to help, we're there to support where we can, but they often are the ones that should be in the lead because they know these issues more than we do.
And Mr. Gonzalez?
Great, thank you. I would say that we absolutely coordinate with our international partners, European and beyond, in terms of collaborating on identifying ways how we can bolster African institutions and support the efforts that African institutions take the lead on. Most recently, in terms of ECOWAS and their dynamic role in supporting the post-coup dynamics in both Guinea and Mali, my conversations with Sahel envoys and counterparts from Canada, the EU, France, and the UK and beyond very much focus on how can we best and optimally support them. And we ask that question directly. We don't just divine the answers, but we go directly to President Brew of the ECOWAS Commission or the representatives of the United Nations and the African Union in the field of how can we best support you. And the collaboration, the dialogue has been robust. And fundamentally, this is at the core of the Biden administration's partnership with Africa, is working very closely and in very close coordination with African institutions.
I hope for the day when these conflicts happen, that they're dealt with and resolved on the continent. I wanted to ask you about a couple of them. Well, one, in CAR, a big concern about the role of Russia and the mercenaries who say they are independent, not affiliated with the Russian government. If you have a comment about that. And then also in terms of some of the violence that we see, you know, how much of it is ideological? Just take Mozambique, for example, that doesn't have a history of this. how much of it is ideological and how much of it is opportunist? Basically, when people feel they have no other alternative. You want to respond first, Mr. Jenkins or Mr. Gonzalez, whichever one want to respond.
I'll take that. In terms of Central African Republic, we're very concerned about the human rights abuses that are underway at the hands of the Wagner Group mercenaries, Kremlin-linked mercenaries, as well as the armed forces of the Central African Republic, both in terms of their direct dynamics, but frankly also the lack of coordination of various actors. We have a very large, robust, and critically important international UN peacekeeping operation on the ground there. And the lack of coordination of what is going on by other actors really puts the international efforts under stress, particularly as humanitarian actors and the peacekeeping operations try to access areas where Wagner or others are operating. In terms of ideological versus other, frankly, I think often what we see are these are long-standing historical grievances of communities against the center or core periphery type issues. People feel that the state hasn't delivered for them. And when the extremists come in and offer something brighter, shinier, more that they can aspire to, it's appealing. And frequently it's that kind of dynamic, as well as opportunists and criminal groups that take advantage rather than its ideology that's driving it.
Well, thank you. And I think it's important that we stay centered on that too, because really the goal should be to address the root causes versus just view it as a problem of violence or ideology. With that, I'd like to go to the ranking member, Mr. Smith.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And thank you for the hearing and to our witnesses for their insights in testimony. I wanted to ask if I could, I don't know if you heard my opening comments, but, the concerns that I and many others have concerning the Fulani and really an international misperception, it would appear, including some at state, about what they're all about. It's not about herdsmen versus farmers. There may be some historical reasons to think that, but today, particularly under Buhari, it would appear that this is an all-out attempt to eradicate, to kill. I have met with many leaders in Nigeria, including just a little while ago again today, who say when a phone call goes out or a message goes out to send the police to try to intervene, there's the police, the military are a no-show. In one case, I was told how just 2 kilometers away from an attack by the Fulani were the Nigerian army, and they refused to come. And so people and women were slaughtered, raped, and people came in on motorbikes for a very fast blitzkrieg type attack, particularly at the churches, but also throughout the town. And, the Church of the Brethren, has seen something on the order of 48,000 dead people over these last 10 years. I mean, when you start adding it all up, I see no difference, frankly, between the Fulani and Boko Haram. And maybe, Mr. Gonzalez, you could speak to that, both of our witnesses, because even when the aircraft were used, the Tucano aircraft, there were 3 instances where civilians were killed. Are we assured? Are we sure that this was a mistake, or were these individuals targeted? So it's who happen to be Christians, of course, and and they also go after Shia Muslims. So there's animosity, if you will, towards people who have to be of Islam, but from a different perspective, and they get hurt as well, or killed. But the predominance of it is against the Christians. I met with a bishop who came and testified at a hearing last year, and he was roundly criticized by Buhari for what he said. And when he talked, this bishop, is all about reconciliation, love, manifesting the love of Christ, but also telling the truth. And he spoke very boldly, but very compassionately, and then said the Fulani, what is the difference? This is me talking, not him now, between other terrorist groups and the Fulani. We all know that Buhari used to be the head of the Fulani. The fact, and I said in my opening comments, virtually everyone around him, the whole military infrastructure, the police infrastructure, all of it is packed with Fulani. And they have access to grind, and they also look the other way when these killings take place. Finally, good luck. Jonathan had his flaws. I thought, all of us have flaws, but he at least had a cabinet that was multi-ethnic, and it had people from all the persuasions. I remember, and Karen, I'm sure you met with them as well. They came from all different perspectives, and that became a very positive strength for Good Luck Jonathan. So if you could, Mr. Gonzalez, speak to some of those issues. Again, are we investigating the Kano fighters, fighter jets, the fighter aircraft? Is there any thought of borrowing any further spare parts if they don't, come clean on? Now it's 3, and there may be more where they've been strafing. And killing.
And Mr. Gonzalez, if you could answer briefly, and then Mr. Smith, we'll do another round after other members have had. You could answer briefly so I can go to Mr. Phillips.
Great. Thank you, Representative Smith. There's a lot to unpack there. I think Nigeria has many challenges and has over many years with many causes, deep-rooted corruption, lack of national identity, patronage-based politics. The long list can go on, and I would argue that those go well beyond any one leader. Nigeria fundamentally is core to our interests, our economic interests, our stability interests, our security interests, our regional and global interests. And so we must engage in support for a strong, stable, and prosperous Nigeria, and we're committed to doing that. I think at the local level, I take your point. I would argue, however, that climate change is reducing resources and population growth is increasing demand for those. And so the availability of resources is a dynamic that is driving some degree of conflict. But a conflict in Nigeria is multidimensional. So too are the Fulani community. The Fulanis are not a monolith. And while President Buhari is a Fulani, so too Macky Sall and numerous leaders across West Africa. And there are Fulani herders and Fulani farmers. I would argue that a non-differentiated approach that identifies the Fulani or frankly any individual group as a major driver is not particularly helpful in identifying the nuance, and ultimately we need to respond with the nuance. But frankly, it also risks precipitating retaliation and further violence. So I think at the local level, engagement with local communities on conflict resolution is key. We're engaging on that, and Rob, I'm sure Assistant Administrator Jenkins can discuss some of that. And at the national level, frankly, I think the approach required is to help shape political discourse, to drive public demand for issue-based, citizen-responsive, nationally supportive policies, not only going into the elections in 2023, but holding those who come out of those elections victorious, accountable for delivering for the country. I think that you mentioned the Super Tucanos. 6 of them have arrived, 6 are still en route. They may be arriving around now. They have not yet been in use, and so the US-provided Super Tucanos are not involved in the incidents that you.
Do we know what was, Mr. Gonzalez?
I can get back to you with that, but we saw the strikes that hit civilians just in the past week, and the change in doctrine because of our engagement with the Nigerian Air Force has been instrumental in getting them to acknowledge, put out a statement, and convene a board of inquiry within 24 hours of that strike. And so there is a doctrinal shift, but the threat to security of the Nigerian people is real. And that's why the State Department, both the Africa All-Mill and DRL bureaus are all unanimous in our support for providing helicopter support that the Nigerians have asked for, so that we can help the Nigerian Air Force protect civilians and convoys of humanitarian assistance.
I know I'm out of time. Thank you.
Mr. Phillips.
Thank you, Chairwoman Bass. Greetings, colleagues. I want to salute our very interesting hearing timer that we're using on this meeting. And also, I've got 3% left on my iPad. If I happen to drop please go ahead and move to the next, my next colleague. But I want to focus my questions on Ethiopia. We all know what is going on, how horrific. The UN estimates that 5.2 million people in Tigray need emergency food assistance. More than 2 million have been displaced by violence. Of course, it's extending to other regions, including Amhara. Hundreds of thousands of people are being displaced and food insecurity worsening. And the worst is that humanitarian aid is being blocked because of the conflict by both Ethiopian and Eritrean militaries, as we all know. So my question first is to you, Gonzalez. As we're aware, the administration announced a new sanctions regime that allows the U.S. to impose financial sanctions on individuals and entities in connection with the conflict. My question is, have you seen any change at all in behavior from these actors since the announcement was made?
Thank you, sir. At this point, we have not yet seen the tangible action that we are looking to see. But that's the point of the executive order, is that it's gone too long with too little action. And so this is the effort to step up the pressure on those who are responsible for prolonging the conflict, for obstructing progress and hindering humanitarian access, and those who commit human rights abuses. It's not targeted to one group or another. There is plenty of blame to go around, and leaders on all sides have been vocal in using their rhetoric for inflaming situations and dehumanizing other communities. And the purpose of the executive order is to exert that pressure so that we can try to break this logjam.
So we talk about pressure. You know, we have hearings, we tweet, we issue press releases, we have press conferences, we condemn. But what tools do we have available to us that we might not be employing to push for humanitarian access, let alone a ceasefire? What tools are we not employing, if any?
I think it's a phased approach. The restrictions on security assistance, the public statements, we just now have a new African Union lead negotiator for the Horn of Africa. And so going back to Chair Bass's point of backing African institutions and putting our support behind President Obasanjo. So I think the executive order is the next step. Applying names, naming and shaming, and holding and squeezing people responsible under that executive order will be follow on. But this is something that has the highest level of attention at the State Department and frankly across the administration. I know Administrator Power, Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield, Secretary Blinken are all seized with this issue in Ethiopia.
And of course, you're referring to Ambassador Feltman. Perhaps with my remaining time, you could speak to some of the activities that he has undertaken since being named to that role, and what roadblocks he's facing, and how he's adapting to these challenges.
So he shares the suite with me 2 doors down, and he's more absent than present because he's always on the road leading U.S. engagements, whether it's in Ethiopia or the region, engaging with the African Union and other African institutions, or frankly, the international community of like-mindeds and other partners who are also seized with this. So he was up in New York engaging with the Deputy Prime Minister just last week, and in Addis the week before, and in Khartoum currently. And so he's very much engaged in trying to explore every opening that we might have, and helping the administration identify what might be those additional pressure points that we can lean on to get progress.
I appreciate it. I can't, the clock seems to have stalled. If I do have a few seconds left, Mr. Jenkins, if you might speak to any leverage or pressure points that the U.S. has with the Ethiopian government or the TPLF to push for increased humanitarian access in Tigray.
Well, thank you, Congressman. I think, as you know, our Administrator Power is laser focused on the issues in Ethiopia and in Tigray, and seeking accountability for the atrocities that have happened. As Das Gonzalez says, there is enough blame to go around on all sides in that terrible, terrible situation. What we're also worried about, and I would like to draw attention to, is we did an atrocity prevention analysis internally that showed there are about 13 possible other fault lines within Ethiopia, any one of which could ignite. Many of them are already simmering. And as we're all focused on Tigray right now, as we should be, hopefully the lid will not blow off what could be a far more dire situation in Ethiopia. That's why we are very supportive of Special Envoy Feltman's efforts, and hopefully the bad situation is going on now, we will be able to exert the leverage that does exist to open up humanitarian access, quell the current violence, and hopefully prevent that situation from spiraling into an even worse situation.
Thank you both for being with us today. With that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Representative Mercer? Representative Mercer? You, sir?
I'm sorry, Madam Chair. Yes, Muser. Thank
Muser.
you, Representative Bass. I appreciate it. Thank you. Mr. Gonzalez, Fulani violence against Christians in North and Central Nigeria is growing very violent on a daily basis. It is apparent that President Buhari has exacerbated this decades-long conflict by eliminating accountability for perpetrators of such violence. In fact, he has installed many Fulani at high levels of government, especially in policing and the judiciary. Nigeria is a rapidly growing country, on track to be the third largest country by 2050, but is now on the verge of serious violence. Excuse me. Does the State Department agree that Nigeria is on the brink of disintegration, and that President Buhari has failed to uphold his responsibility to protect the rights of all Nigerians? Mr.
Congressman,
Gonzalez.
we're incredibly concerned about security and stability in Nigeria. Again, I mentioned to Representative Smith that it's multifaceted, whether it's pirates or bandits or Fulanis or religious or ISIS West Africa. The threats against the people, the threats against the state are many. I also look at frankly, the numbers. We have 208 million people who are protected by 375 or so thousand police and about 100,000 troops, making basically a ratio of the security sector to civilians about 1/9 the global standard that is optimal. And so there's fundamentally inadequate resources that have gone to security, and inadequate resources, or attention, I would say, at the senior-most levels going towards a security strategy that can stem the tide. We're encouraged by President Buhari's replacement of the entire slate of senior brass and security sector officials in Nigeria. We're encouraged that the new chief of defense has recognized that responding to insecurity requires a whole of government approach, not just an approach by the army or the armed forces, but all elements of the government. We're encouraged that the chief of the Air Force is commissioning a 9-month doctrine review to ensure that what the government does to respond to insecurity doesn't further inflame or fuel. So again, the challenges are many on the security side as well as on the civilian side, and that's why our close relationship with the array of actors across Nigeria is vital to help to try to shape and shift what is really a keystone country in the region.
It sounds like you know a lot about it. I'm trying to figure out what we're doing about it, however. By chance, has the State Department yourself been to Nigeria lately or met with any of its parliament members to discuss this?
So I guess the most recent would be about a week ago, where I, as well as our acting assistant secretary, met with 4 representatives of the Nigeria Governors Association who were in town. We've had about 3 intended visits that for one reason or another has fallen through.
I doubt they told you that climate change was their biggest concern. Okay, I'm not saying it's not a concern, but targeted murders and assassinations of large numbers of civilians within communities, and primarily Christians, not just Christians, but also Shia and others. So the idea of President Buhari not really answering my question as far as failing to protect the rights of all Nigerians, I'm not sure, but we're sort of making the problem larger rather than just understanding that Buhari has some responsibility here, and as do we, if we care about any humanitarian efforts in in Nigeria. So I just have another question for you. The policing of weapons trafficking into West Africa that is obviously contributing to the heightened violence. Is that something the U.S. government is policing?
I would not say that the U.S. government is policing it. I would say that certainly elements of the State Department, particularly my counterparts in the International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Bureau, are supporting through funds appropriated from Congress a fair bit of support to build the capacity of African institutions, African government elements for improving border security, awareness of who and what is crossing through borders. Those borders are incredibly porous, and it's a big challenge, but certainly it is something that we are seized with, yes.
All right, that's great. Was there a fuller scale, deep study dive into the conflict in Nigeria in the previous administration that was terminated by the Biden administration in January, or was it deviated, or was it a different?
Excuse
I'm
me.
sorry, Madam Chair, I didn't have the timer. I yield back. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Let me move to Representative Manning. Representative Manning?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Sorry about that. Thank you so much for having this hearing along with Chairman Deutsch and the ranking members. This is really a critically important and difficult issue. Let me start with Mr. Jenkins. Terrorist organizations continue to exploit inadequate security and governance in many countries in Africa, recruiting some of the most vulnerable people in these societies, as you have talked about, and producing violence that furthers the cycle of instability and poverty. And several of these countries have also suffered droughts, food insecurity, and civic unrest, creating more openings for terrorist groups to grow and thrive. Can you talk to us a little bit more about how the USAID program seeks to break this vicious cycle, and can you point to some success stories?
Oh, thank you, Representative. I could try to go through what we're doing in Mali. I could give you a description of what we're doing in Cameroon. I could give you a description of what we're doing in Somalia. A lot of those, when you talk about the objectives at the top high level, sound very, very similar, because while all of these crises and all of these conflicts are different and context is extremely important, the underlying causes for them are actually similar. It's a governance crisis. In every one of these, it's a governance crisis. So the violence we see, the exploitation, the recruitment is a symptom of the underlying more serious causes. So our programs look different in different places, but they're almost all trying to, one, give youth a reason to have agency, the ability to have agency in their life, give them meaning is what they're looking for. Two, bringing societies together, trying to heal the divisions, opening up dialogue. Three, trying to get communities at the local level, but also at the national level to understand what is really happening in their country, in their village. Many of these problems are misdiagnosed. We easily say, oh, this is ideological, this is religious, this is transnational crime. It can be all of those things at the same time. So where has it worked? Let's go to North Africa real quick. CERT. People forget that in Libya, CERT Libya was the largest place outside of Iraq and Syria where ISIS was in control. When that city was liberated in 2016, immediately we went to work supporting the local government, $16 million over about a year. 30,000 kids went back to school, 40,000 people got health care. Within 1 year, 90% of the population that was displaced moved back, and year after year in annual polling, people are more optimistic and feeling better about local governance and about their life. We forget about Liberia. Liberia in the 1990s was synonymous with fragile states and failed states. 2006, we have a new president. We get in there, get to work, the United States in a very big way, other partners too, but with supporting Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, and Liberia is a success story today. So I would lastly go in Kenya, where they're coming up to elections again, and we always cross our fingers and hope that things don't get bad like they have in the past. But in Kenya, working with the Kenyan government, we've helped them create their own national counterterrorism center. They are now training all of their civil servants on looking for CVE and coming up with CVE solutions, and going down to the county level, working on CVE plans that are indigenous to those localities, so people are aware and finding their own systemic solutions.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Deputy Assistant Secretary Gonzalez, I am concerned that women and girls are often victimized by or at the root of the outbreak of violence and conflict throughout Africa. Can you tell us how state is working to address gender-based violence in Africa, and how working with our partners in the region has improved gender equality and protects women at risk?
I completely share your concern, and I think it starts with the engagements that we have when we send our ambassadors in to talk to heads of state, when we flag this very concern, that we recognize that gender-based violence is one of the top flags for potential for atrocities in the future, but also the opposite, where gender equality yields societies that are much less likely to go to war. It's why women, peace, and security is a critical element of our security assistance package. I look at Niger, for example, a prime example where previously each year the Nigerian military would take in just 10 women. Now it's over 300 and still a long ways to go. But by having women be the providers of security along with men, they engage with societies, they engage with the vulnerable in a different way and help provide that security. And finally, because I see the time is up, just a month and a half ago when Undersecretary for Political Affairs Toria Nuland and I met with President Bazoum in Niger, we were thrilled to hear that his #1 priority is educating girls, because ultimately that's going to be what delivers the brighter future for the society.
Thank you very much, and I yield back.
Representative Omar.
Thank you, Chairwoman Bass. Mr. Gonzalez, I wanted to see if you can tell us, has the administration finalized a strategic plan for our policies towards Somalia, the Sahel, and the DRC?
Sorry, I took a moment to find my mute button. I understand that this, I'm not directly engaged with the Somalia policy, but my understanding is that it is moving forward through the interagency. I am very much engaged day in and day out on the Sahel strategy, and I'm pleased to say that it is quite far along. Certainly there is consensus across the interagency in terms of the theory of the case and the theory of change. It's a big territory with disparate environments, and so the key will be on how we implement to respond to the specific nuances in each location, recognizing that resources are limited and we can't do everything, and we can't even do the select things everywhere, and so we must prioritize, but we're not going to succeed if we don't have a strategy. And so we are, this administration definitely is focused on developing strategies that are not only pursued at post, but are endorsed here in Washington so that the totality of the US government is pursuing it.
Yeah, I ask because every time I've traveled to Africa, I've been briefed on the need to balance the 3 Ds, but we haven't seen any evidence of that balance. And I've seen that the Pentagon has been calling the shots, especially in Somalia. So it's really important that we get a comprehensive strategy on all of these countries. Public reporting has indicated that the drone strikes we have conducted this year in Somalia were approved by AFRICOM rather than the White House. Is that your understanding too?
That would really be a question for the Department of Defense. I'm not sure about the protocols and how they exercise those authorities.
Okay. Do you know what the legal basis for these strikes were?
My understanding is that they're based in collective self-defense, but in terms of the specific legalities, I'm afraid I don't have that information. I'm not a lawyer.
I have a letter out to you all, so I hope you'll expedite some answers for me in that regard. Do you know how many designated foreign terrorist organizations that mainly operated in the sub-Saharan Africa prior to the 2001, before our war on terror began?
No, ma'am, I don't. I can certainly get that for you.
It was 0. Do you know how many are there now?
I just cleared off on the list a couple of days ago, so I've seen it, but the number I don't have off the top of my head.
There are 10 at the moment. So we went from 0 to 10 since 2001. I think it's very hard to claim that our security first approach to counterterrorism, including drone strikes and partnering with security forces that violate human rights, is working. Are you familiar with the 2017 report from the United Nations Development Program entitled Journey to Extremism in Africa?
I am, and in fact, that's the I believe that's the report that Assistant Administrator Jenkins cited in terms of the 71% figure in terms of why people go to violent extremists, is because 71% of them had recently experienced a case of abuse at the hands of state authorities.
Yeah, and it is really important that we do understand that very context, right? That the root causes of this might be very different depending on where you are on the content, but that the flashpoint for most of these people to join these organizations is human rights violation. So how is it that we are effectively combating terrorism in Africa by supporting security forces that are enacting these human rights violations, which is something that Mr. Jenkins didn't answer? And how can we say it's good for stability when there have been 2 coups in Mali, 1 in Guinea, 1 in Chad, all within a year?
So I'll go back to your first question about strategy. And I think because the Sahel strategy captures this quite nicely. At the core of our Sahel strategy is we recognize that the cause is a governance deficiency. The remedy must be a governance response. And so it brings the United States government in totality focused on supporting governance at the national level in terms of what are the capabilities fighting corruption, transparency, accountability.
Like, sir, I'm sorry. It seems like our strategy is to support the same governing bodies that continue to cause instability and continue to cause human rights violations, which in turn has increased the number of people who are joining terrorism and has increased the level of terrorism that exists in the continent. I mean, we are currently involved heavily in all of these countries, yet they continue to get destabilized every year. So what are we doing that is different, and what have we learned from our involvement?
So again, I would argue that we can't counter the security threat or the governance threat if we're not engaging with the government that's involved in both sides of that. And so bolstering governance at the national level and the local level, but also engaging with security and enabling the security sector institutions to become more capable, more responsible, and responsive to the needs of the citizens, and frankly, more accountable. I am incredibly blunt with my African counterparts in terms of the role that their forces' activities in abusing civilians play in driving citizens into the hands of extremists. And not only do we need to support and protect and hold accountable abuses of human rights because it's the right thing to do and it's our values, but fundamentally it's critical to providing security and stability and public confidence back in the state.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you, Chairwoman, for your generosity. I think it's really important that we also take accountability for the policies that we're engaging in and how that is, fueling some of the things that are happening in the continent. So thank you, and I look forward to following up with you, Mr. Gonzalez.
Representative Sherman.
Thank you, and thank you. I want to thank the chairs for convening this hearing. The first question relates to the Nile and Ethiopia's new dam. I wonder if Mr. Gonzalez can tell us what are the legal constraints on Ethiopia in filling this dam, both under the traditional international law of riparian states and according to any treaty obligations that Ethiopia has assumed.
Great. Thank you, Congressman. Again, not a lawyer and haven't reviewed the particulars of Ethiopia's treaty obligations, but fundamentally,
Does the U.S. have a position on what are the legal rights? I mean, this is one of the biggest disputes in East Africa, biggest international disputes. Do we know whether Ethiopia says, hey, the water goes through our country, we get to dam it up, or is that a legitimate position legally or not?
we know that Ethiopia says that, and we know that the downstream effects are there. Ultimately, the answer needs to be in a solution that is viable to the existence and the needs of all three of the member states. And that's why we have tried over and over to lend our good offices both directly, as we've seen in recent years, as well as other
reclaiming my time, I'll have to go to other legal experts, but you would think that in addition to just believing that it'd be great if everybody works things out, we would know what the legal rights of the parties are. And that we'd be standing up not only for everybody getting along, which is great, but also for international law. Turning again to Ethiopia, without objection, I'd like to put into the record the September 2021 situation report published by Amna Tigray. Without objection?
Yes, without objection. Sorry, I was.
Thank you. When you look at the casualties and conflicts, the enormous casualties come from deprivation of food and medicine and disease hitting civilian populations. And that is certainly the case with regard to the dispute in Tigray. We have 2.2 million people who have been internally displaced. We've got millions who face starvation. We have 70,000 Tigrayans who have fled to Sudan. However, the Ethiopian government continues to block humanitarian aid, including food aid from entering the region. Is it our position that that is a gross deprivation of human rights and/or a war crime?
We certainly perceive it a gross deprivation of human rights. In terms of particular war crimes determinations, we're looking at the totality of the information on the situation on the ground with regard to any type of designation along those lines.
What are we doing to get food to the people who need it?
We are engaging across the board with all entities who play.
We're talking to all the entities, but have we gotten any food into the country in the last week? Are trucks moving? Are planes landing?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay, and I know Mr. Jenkins is right beside you there, visually or virtually, and I assume he confirms that unless he wants to speak up.
I can't confirm what's happened in the last week, but we are seized with this issue. We have a disaster assistance response team in country. And yes, we think that it is a deprivation of fundamental human rights.
And we're seized with the issue, but as far as you know, we haven't been able to get in any significant amount of food in the last week.
Not to my knowledge.
Okay. And then finally, Mr. Gonzalez, we lost a war in Afghanistan. To what extent will this inspire extreme Islamic nationalist forces from engaging in terrorism, both against the United States, but also among the African states that we respect and work with?
I would expect that it would certainly inspire them, and all the more reason for us to continue to double down on our engagement with our African partners to respond.
Have we seen any particular increase in recruitment just in the last few weeks, or is this, we've got to be aware of maybe a longer term response?
I would expect it
quickly.
I would expect it's a longer term response, but we have not yet observed that on the ground.
My time has expired.
Thank you. And I'm sorry, members, our clock is off for a minute, so I'm using my phone to keep the time. But let me go to Representative Jacobs right now.
Well, thank you so much, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Jenkins and Mr. Gonzalez for coming before our committee. I think as we've talked about, we really need to look at conflict in a comprehensive way. Secretary Blinken said it best earlier this year. The tactical counterterrorism tools just don't cut it, and instability and violence are fueled by historical social grievances, a lack of accessible public services, and exclusion from political processes. On top of that, we know that abuses by state security forces actually fuel local recruitment into these groups. So we need to make sure our counterterrorism operations are not enabling these abuses. And thinking about these challenges exclusively through the lens of counterterrorism is at best insufficient and at worst counterproductive. In 2018, RAND found that since 1990, our assistance in Africa appears to have little or no effect on political violence. It did, however, find that a more holistic long-term focus centered around governance and institution building would yield better results. So I'm glad to hear you all talk so much about governance during this hearing. When I worked at the State Department, it wasn't always the case that our regional bureaus understood the focus on governance needed to be so much. So I'm very glad to see that. And thank you, Mr. Gonzalez, for carrying that water. And, it's also why I'm so excited about the implementation of the Global Fragility Act and really looking forward to seeing the selection of priority countries as soon as possible. I know we've talked a lot about the Sahel and that the strategy will focus on governance. We're very in support of that. I was just wondering, Mr. Gonzalez, if the administration plans to appoint a special envoy to the Sahel.
At this point, there's no specific plan to do that. Once the Sahel strategy is finalized and we're looking at the specific tactics that would be most appropriate to pursue it, that may be on the table. For the time being, since January 20th, I, as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for both West Africa and Regional Peace and Security, have effectively been serving the function. I engage with the other international envoys for the Sahel as their peer and counterpart and regularly engage with them.
Great, thank you. And I want to move on to the situation in Mozambique. I know folks have brought up the situation in Cabo Delgado. We know that it is not only a case of ideological issues, but exploited grievances of the local population that includes exclusion from economic and political power, unemployment, corruption, abuses by state security forces. But so far, our response has been counterterrorism and security focused, which I think is very problematic. So, Mr. Gonzalez, what's the State Department's plan to devise a comprehensive strategy to address these challenges that actually addresses the underlying grievances of this violence and conflict, and not just more security assistance that I personally think will actually fuel more conflict?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I would just counter that, in fact, our approach on Mozambique is not all about security. In fact, for the bulk of this year, our campaign plan to counter ISIS Mozambique includes 4 lines of effort. The first one is security assistance, because again, providing a response to the manifestation. The second is related to strategic communications and engaging the public, so the public is aware of dynamics and has insight into the threats that are coming, but also on counter-violent extremism messaging. Targeted development and humanitarian assistance is our third line of effort, and then the diplomatic engagement. And in fact, in terms of our outreach to the Nyusi government, it has actually yielded first the appointment of a coordinator for the assistance part of responding to northern Mozambique, and not so much the coordinator for the security component. So I think the security gets a lot of attention because sadly the news that continues to reach us is dire, although turning around in the past couple of weeks. But fundamentally, the core of our strategy really does look at this holistic approach to address the underlying drivers.
I'm glad to hear that. I will say it's hard to message until you have, counter-violent extremism messaging is only useful when you actually have the governance reform to go with it. So I hope you're working with the government of Mozambique to be more politically inclusive of the people of the Cabo Delgado region. In my last few seconds, Mr. Jenkins, I'm sorry?
You have about 15 seconds.
Perfect. In 15 seconds, Mr. Jenkins, what else can Congress do to help USAID respond to peace building and conflict prevention in the continent?
Well, thank you. At 15 seconds, you took a great step with the Global Fragility Act, hold us accountable, make sure that we implement that. Second, we all need to have a conversation about more prevention, not less, and a conversation about less directives, less earmarks, and giving us flexible funding that allows us to not have to plan 3 or 4 years out, but be able to react to something like Cabo Delgado, be able to react to something like the littoral states in coastal West Africa. We need more flexibility, and we need to work with you, get a trust variant there that we know what we're doing and we can work together. Exactly as you're saying, it cannot just be a CT strategy. That's why we don't do CT at AID. We do countering violent extremism, and it's all about the governance.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Representative Vargas.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I want to thank the other chair and, of course, our participants today, especially our witnesses. I want to start where we just left off. More prevention, more flexibility, trust with the youth. So you think that under some of the things that we're doing now, we're getting better at that, but we're not good at it yet. What more should we be doing then in this aspect? What do you need?
Well, thank you, Congressman. We have learned a lot in the last 20 years. I would direct people to the Stabilization Assistance Review, the SAR, that was agreed to and written by State Department, Department of Defense, and USAID in 2018 for the first time. We, as a government, defined what we mean by stabilization. It is about 15 pages of very concise lessons learned, not just from Iraq and Afghanistan, but mainly from those two places. Also, if you have the time, please read the SIGAR, Special Inspector General Afghanistan Reconstruction Report. The 20 report just came out. What have we learned? It's okay to be slow. In fact, slow is better. It's okay to start small. Shut up and listen. Don't go in with the answers. Just because we're the United States does not mean we're going to solve a problem with more people and more money. We need to engage locals. We need to engage them with civil society and their local government. We need to listen to them. We need to stop doing things that aren't working. We need to ramp up things that are working. And all of that needs to be within a strategy where we've defined what success is going to be. We need to be able to resource that plan and be able to resource it in a way that we can move with agility if things start to work better or stop working the way we want to do. We know these things. We've known them for a long time, but we often don't execute them. That is the thing we have to do more, is we are currently learning lessons way too slow. We're acquiring the lessons, we just aren't learning them and acting on them.
One of the things that sounded like that you actually, I don't think you said it, I think Mr. Gonzalez said, but the whole issue of governance, that it's tough working with some of the governance when you know that there's corruption, when there's abuse, and there's all these other things. I mean, how do you do that successfully at the same time making sure that U.S. money is going to the right place? I mean, it is difficult. We just saw what happened in Afghanistan, and I think the American people are not happy about that, and understandably. Of course, we spent so much money there, and because of the corruption, in my opinion, and lack of focus, it really was a disaster at the end of the day.
We cannot let the objective blind us to the reality on the ground. We say this a lot, but we need to mean it. We can't want to help them more than they want our help. We can spend money. I can spend stupid money any day of the week. That's not the objective. The objective is, how do we work with these people, find them where they are? Yes, we cannot tolerate any corruption, any waste, fraud, and abuse. Find a partner at the national level. If there's no proactive change agent there, find someone at the provincial level, find them at the local level. But slow down and realize this is not a short-term endeavor. If it was easy and short-term, we wouldn't have these problems. We've got to be in for the long haul. There's going to be ups, there's going to be downs. We need strategic patience, but we need to be realistic and don't sell ourselves on 6-month to 12-month solutions. These problems are generational. They are going to take time, they're going to take patience, and they're going to take grit. That's what we have to dedicate ourselves to, not the shiny object that we think we can achieve in a few months. If that was the way to fix these things, they'd all be fixed.
I guess lastly, I want to say this, that, you know, obviously we have to be very, very concerned about security and terrorism. Obviously, that's a great concern to us. But I agree, if we don't look at this thing holistically, that's what we're going to get. I mean, if we don't figure it out. My niece was in the Peace Corps in Tanzania, and she was there for 2 years, and unfortunately, because of COVID, she came back even though she applied to stay there longer. And she's a wonderful young lady. It was the greatest experience of her life, of course. And at the same time, she said, you know, I just loved being there. The people loved Americans. I mean, they did. And it's Tanzania, of course, a different area. But, you know, and the help that they were able to receive was development help, too. I mean, the chairwoman said this, and it struck me the other day. It's not really until development comes in a real meaningful way and we intertwine all of our economies that a lot of this will go away, because people need affluence. People need the ability to take care of themselves or family. And when that happens, people feel that, okay, they're part of the world. They have some ownership in their life, call it agency or whatever you want to call it, but they really have ownership over where they're going. And we've got to figure that out. And I don't think we've done a great job. And especially with all the problems we're having in China and elsewhere, I mean, I don't understand why we're not figuring out how to work deeply in a deep economic way with Africa. We need to figure that out. Again, I know my time's probably up. I don't know how the clock works there. The clock's magical.
Yes, no, I'm on my iPhone. You're almost at 6 minutes.
But I thank the chair. And I thank everyone. Thank you very much.
And I thank you, Mr. Vargas, for your instructive comments. Absolutely. Well, members and our witnesses, I want to thank you for your time today. I know we'll have you back another time, because this is an issue that is ongoing, and how to focus and target our authorizing legislation as well as appropriation legislation, I think, will be very important. So I want to thank you very much, and the hearing is adjourned.
Thank you.